Before this video starts, a couple disclaimers. This can be a somewhat touchy topic, so there are some things that I want to make clear going in. First, I do quite a bit of critique in this video, but I am not calling any of these games nor their developers bigoted or hateful. I intentionally chose negative examples that I feel confident in saying were done through either ignorance or accident, but not malice. In fact, I recommend every game I discuss in this video. They're all quite good. I talk about bisexuality a bit, and I do not talk about pansexuality, omnisexuality, polysexuality, etc. I'm not trying to erase anyone, but bisexuality means attraction to more than one gender. So all of those fall under the umbrella of bisexual. Thus, that's the only one I'm going to talk about. Otherwise, we need to get into what differentiates them all. That's a whole can of worms. Sigmund Freud's involved. It's just, no. Lastly, sadly, the audio file for this video got corrupted. Fortunately, I was able to salvage it from an earlier export of the Audacity project that I had done. However, it has resulted in some inconsistent audio quality and certain parts had to be very obviously re-recorded, so I apologize in advance for that and thank you for your understanding. Alright, here's the video. What exactly is a playersexual character? Well, the simplest explanation is that they're a character in a video game willing to enter a romance or sleep with the player's character regardless of if they're playing a man or a woman or neither. The problem with that explanation is that it forgets about the fact that bisexual people exist. Since characters are allowed to be bisexual, are playersexual characters even real? What's the difference between a playersexual character and a bisexual character? Well, that's what I'm hoping to answer with this video. I believe that playersexual characters can be broken down into three separate subtypes. Type 1, where the writers didn't really want to give canon sexualities, so every romanceable NPC is just attracted to whatever. Type 2, where characters are obviously straight, but they function as a same-sex romance, so they really only ever show attraction to the same sex if it is the player's character. And the third type, which is an inverse of Type 2, a character who is written to be gay, but can still be romanced by player characters of the opposite sex. Types 2 and 3 are obviously very similar, but they come from incredibly different places. Now, are playersexual characters bad? That's hard to give a simple answer to. Sometimes, but not always, the complaint of playersexuality is made in bad faith. People don't like that gay or bi characters exist in the game at all, and use complaints of playersexuality to disguise that they just don't like having to think about the existence of LGBT people. Now, in my personal opinion, the first and second type of playersexual characters are much better than there just being no LGBT romance options or LGBT characters in the game at all. The third type of playersexual characters just shouldn't exist at all. Now, let's dive into the first type of a playersexual character. For a game that's very, very blatantly full of playersexual characters, we can look at Skyrim. In Skyrim, you can get married and adopt children. Every single marriageable character can be married by either sex. It's never once talked about, it's treated exactly the same as a straight marriage. And that may sound nice to see it treated as entirely normalized, but you see absolutely no gay couples throughout the world. Like, none at all. There's a couple of implied gay characters who you can find dead. So there is not LGBT representation. They just didn't restrict the marriage. It is essentially a straight marriage with two characters of the same sex. The thing is, the spouses being playersexual isn't a bad thing at all, but the lack of actual proper LGBT characters isn't great. The marriage system in Skyrim is really shallow. There are a set group of characters that can be married once you've gotten their approval high enough, and 90% of the time you get their approval through a quest. Characters act very similarly once you marry them. They bake you a pie, give you some gold, and occasionally get kidnapped. There's really not any character interaction involved in a goddamn marriage. It's mostly just gameplay gimmicks. So having the relationships be playersexual isn't really a problem because it's already so shallow. And Bethesda does at least get some points for making characters of both sexes flirt with you when you wear the Amulet of Mara. They don't tone down the gay flirting at all. This kind of playersexuality isn't that bad, at least in my opinion, because it treats all types of sexualities as the same. It's okay for a game to not feel comfortable really diving into the nuances of different sexualities while still trying to provide representation. It's not ideal, but it's not that bad. In my opinion, the other two types are worse. So let's talk about those. The second type of player sexuality isn't great, but it's not inherently offensive. It can at least be well-meaning. For a good example of this type, let's take a look at Fire Emblem Three Houses. There are varying degrees of player sexuality on display in this game. You've got some characters like Rhea and Edelgard who show romantic interest in pretty much nobody but the player. But the most common form of player sexuality in Three Houses is this second type. How romance works in Three Houses is that when you get to the end of the game, you can S-support a character, where you then enter the romantic relationship with them and live happily ever after. You need to have built a strong enough relationship in the game for this to be available. You have access to all of the opposite sex S-supports and a few same-sex S-supports. There are no entirely gay S-supports. However, the player character is not the only one who can enter a romance. At the end of the game, you will see epilogue slides detailing what happened to your units when the game ends. If two characters got along very well, they might get a paired ending where they stay in each other's lives. Sometimes these are romantic endings, sometimes they're simply entertaining, and some are damn tragic. There is only one completely undeniably gay paired romantic ending. And funny enough, it involves a character that the player cannot enter a same-sex relationship with. There are a few others that could be interpreted as romantic, but generally speaking, any romantic paired endings are between characters of the opposite sex. Pretty much every character except for Dorothea is just straight, but willing to be gay for the player. And it's nice to at least have gay options at all, but they're just so pathetically token. And the male gay options were really fucking poorly done. I'll run through these quickly. 2 of the 3 men that you could S-support as a male character were also the only non-romantic S-supports in the entire game. And depending on your route, they explicitly married your character to a woman. What the fuck? If the player does what normally locks in a romance with a character of the same sex, do not then explicitly marry them to the opposite sex. The only actual gay option was Lindhart, who is obviously just straight. He explicitly flirts with a few women in the game and shows zero interest in men ever. It just feels like he was the one they were willing to sacrifice. And he is hardly a catch. His personality can be summed up as Sheldon Cooper with narcolepsy. But hey, they added a new gay option for free as DLC. And it's like, super gay. Feels weird to romance them with a woman, honestly. So what's the problem? This new super gay character is the fucking Death Knight! Look at this guy! They said, yeah, this guy can be super gay! Meanwhile, they wrote Claude, who is so clearly bisexual, but you can't romance him with a man for some reason, despite him fucking doing this. But Three Houses managed to do a few things right. Dorothea is a pretty solid bisexual character. She flirts with men and women, and can enter a proper relationship with a woman who is not the player. However, I feel like she can get close to the harmful, horny/greedy bisexual stereotype. They really knocked it out of the park in their DLC, however. I'll come back to this. For now, let's move on to the third type of player sexuality, which I feel is the most inherently offensive, which is when a character is clearly gay. They only show attraction to the same sex with one exception, the player's character. This is harmful because it implies that you can be turned straight by the right person. And I'm sure that's rarely ever intended, but you just cannot have a character who is only attracted to the same sex with one person being the exception without implying this. Dragon Age is quite guilty of this, honestly, with the most egregious example being Leliana. She is a character very clearly written as a lesbian. The only time she ever shows romantic or sexual interest in men is when it's directed towards a male player character. However, there's not much to say about Leliana. She is obviously a lesbian character that they just made bisexual because for one reason or another, they weren't willing to say, no, you can't romance her, she's not attracted to men. It wasn't until Mass Effect 3 that BioWare finally had the balls to have romance options be strictly gay. I don't think I really need to explain why this isn't great. I feel like everyone understands that you shouldn't be scared to have fully gay characters. So how do you avoid making characters player-sexual? How do you make them actually properly bisexual? I think the best way to answer is to look at how not to do it. So, Let's take a look at what I consider the most poorly done player-sexual character in all of gaming. And would you look at that, it's from Dragon Age. Anders in Dragon Age 2. Dragon Age 2 is one of the only games where I think it is genuinely fair to complain that a character rubbed their gayness in the player's face. A lot of times people complain about that because a character just mentioned that they're gay. It is so often made in bad faith. But in this case, even I agree that is too much. Anders is both incredibly in your face with his gayness, yet also player sexual. So how does he rub it in your face? Well, Anders is a character who first appears in Dragon Age Awakening. He joins you within about 10 minutes of starting the expansion and is with you until the end. So you get to know him really well and there's a good chance that you like him. He then returns as a character in Dragon Age 2, running a free clinic for refugees, and he's the only real healer in your party unless you play as one yourself. The reason you meet with him is that you need a map that he has, and you could potentially use his help on an expedition. He agrees to give you the map and his aid if you help save his boyfriend. However, upon finding him, it's revealed that Anders' boyfriend has been essentially magically lobotomized. Anders then mercy kills his boyfriend, and you return to his clinic, where he then talks to you about the sad events that took place between Dragon Age Awakening and Dragon Age 2, which involve another character from Awakening. The problems with the romance don't come into play in this wrap-up. It happens the very next time you talk with him, and it can and very likely will be immediately after the wrap-up ends, because there's no cooldown between the mission ending and when you can trigger this next dialogue. He then goes into more details about what happened between Awakening and Dragon Age 2. You're then presented with these dialogue options, one of which is obviously flirting and is marked as such, but the only other dialogue option that does not involve berating the man who just confided in you about how much he regrets what he did and who recently mercy killed his boyfriend is also considered flirting. Apparently BioWare thought that the only reason somebody would be nice in this circumstance is if they wanted to get laid. You're then presented with 3 options, 2 of which continue the romance you just accidentally started, and only 1 of which backs out. And the break it off option is super aggressive at best and has an ew fuck off gay boy vibe at worst. When you break it off, you get rivalry points, and while rivalry points aren't bad, this happens early on in the game when you likely won't understand that rivalry points aren't purely negative. Notice what's missing from this wheel? There's no, "Hey Anders, I'm sorry if you misunderstood or if I led you on, but I'm not attracted to men" option. So let's take a second to really look at this. The majority of players are going to pick male hawk because that's just what happens in any game where you can pick your gender. The majority of players are going to be nice to the refugee doctor going through rough shit, and the majority of players are likely going to just be straight. Because of how it's set up, a lot of straight male players end up in a situation that seemingly punishes them for not being gay. BioWare, what the hell were you thinking? This is not good representation. So it certainly seems like Anders is just the third kind of player sexual, right? He's clearly written to be a gay character that they also let female players date. Well, in Awakening, Anders does quite a bit of flirting, but only ever with women. He even mentions having a wife one day. So making him bisexual already has an air of retcon to it. And if you're playing a male hawk, he never shows a single sign of that attraction to women that was explicitly established in Awakening. But the worst part, that boyfriend I mentioned, he is only Anders' boyfriend if you're playing as male hawk. If you're playing a lady hawk, then it's only his close friend. If you play as a woman, the game wipes any hints of Anders' interest in men. It makes it feel like they're trying to hide it or swipe it under the rug when they can get away with it. He can have a male ex and still be interested in women. This supports the toxic and harmful idea that bisexual people don't exist and are actually just straight or gay depending on who they're with. So they managed to make Anders the worst in just every aspect here. Honestly, the way Dragon Age 2 handles character sexuality is just a mess overall. But I feel completely confident in saying that none of it was done maliciously. It is clear that this game wanted to explore these aspects more deeply than most games are willing to, and I think that all this messiness was just caused by the game's absolutely minuscule development time. So how do you avoid making a bisexual character player sexual? How do you make them a properly well-written bisexual character? That's hard to answer, but let's take a look at who I consider to be some of the best bisexual representation in any video game. Yuri from Fire Emblem Three Houses, specifically the Ashen Wolves DLC. So how on earth does Three Houses have my favorite bisexual representation? Well, they clearly know how to write a great bi character. They did it with Dorothea and Claude. Then they just, didn't let you actually romance Claude as a man for some reason. But I digress. Yuri is an amazing bisexual character because they do not hide his bisexuality while avoiding stereotypes, and there are actually references to bi culture. His bisexuality is something that is well acknowledged without him just being a horn dog who flirts with everyone. And he reflects how LGBT people see themselves rather than how they're seen by the outside world, which is a pretentious way of saying he can be summed up as be bi do crime. He's a tricky schemer who works in the underworld as a caretaker for a downtrodden shantytown. Breaking the rules to care for others and having an underground society were how LGBT people had to live for so long, and it's still how they have to live in certain areas. The Robin Hood sort of mindset is still so prevalent in the community because of this. A good way that they acknowledge his bisexuality and weave it into the plot is when in the Ashen Wolves DLC, you form a secret plan with him. The cover for the time that you spend formulating this plan is that he asked you out on a date, and this is the same whether you're playing as a man or a woman. His bisexuality is also properly acknowledged by other characters, a good example being when Balthus attempts to bribe him by promising to show off his abs. And best of all is this little touch. The 4 new students in the DLC have an associated class, and Yuri's class is the Trickster, a class who mixes sword fighting and magic. And the Trickster class casts that magic through finger guns. For those that don't know, finger guns are bisexual culture, meaning that bi people tend to just do them a lot for no particular reason. It's just innate within us. And this is something decently well known and acknowledged within the community. So this detail feels so specific that it seems impossible that it's an accident. I cannot for a second believe that it's just a series of coincidences that he so perfectly represents and references the bisexual community. They clearly did their research and it paid off immensely. So, what could be concluded from looking at all of this? Well, here's what I believe. Characters being playersexual is something that happens, but it's not necessarily a problem. Playersexual characters only seem like a problem because they tend to be paired with the actual issue of LGBT relationships being sidelined and given less respect than the straight ones. The first type of playersexuality really isn't that bad because it's an equalizer. In Skyrim, the same-sex relationships for the player are very shallow, but it's fine because the straight relationships for the player are just as shallow, meaning that they were given an equal amount of care and work. The problems come up more often with the second and third types of playersexuality. The problem that tends to be present alongside the second type of playersexuality is a lack of effort put into the same-sex relationships. Usually the romances for straight player characters end up feeling much more planned and natural, while the same-sex relationships are lesser experienced that feel kind of tacked on or half-assed. A reason this could happen is that the writers are mostly straight and thus do not feel comfortable nor know how to write a real proper gay character. So they write what they know, a straight character, and then they just have that straight character be gay in what they think is the only place it matters, as a romance option. And it's really only a problem if this makes up the bulk of the same-sex romance options. If a few of them are like this, it's totally fine. And there's almost always more straight options than there are gay options, so providing more choice to gay players is a good thing, even if some of the choices are a bit mediocre. The third type of playersexuality is the only inherently bad type. The only way it can be inoffensive is if the character was always intended to be bisexual, and they inadvertently failed to properly establish their attraction to the opposite sex. When a character is very clearly written to be gay, but will also romance a player character of the opposite sex, you cannot separate that from harmful ideas. Being harassed by people who think they're so amazing that they can turn you straight is something gay people, especially lesbian women, have to face a lot. And as for bisexuality in games, of course not every game needs to have representation on the caliber of Yuri. And there are plenty of bisexual people who lean heavily towards the same or opposite sex with only a few exceptions. Just remember that it does exist. Actual characters that are established as bisexual and have it as part of their identity are very rare. The vast majority of bisexual characters in video games are playersexual, with bisexuality treated as if it's merely flipping between being straight and gay rather than being its own sexuality. And sadly, many times when a character actually is established as bisexual, they're also a pervert. The depraved bisexual trope is so obscenely overdone. So yeah, playersexuality itself is not a bad thing. A lack of respect for LGBT people is a bad thing. And you are of course free to have your own preference on playersexuality. You may like it, you may think it provides more freedom and romance options that the player is under no obligation to choose, or you may think it's a negative that drags romance down in games. Do you agree with my conclusion? Do you have an entirely different take? I'd love to know what you all think on this. Just make sure to keep it all civil. Thanks for watching, everyone.